Morning. Griffin, I want to thank you for the warm introduction and say to you that you certainly have a fine first name. One of the young partners at King Spalding saw the title of this speech that I'm supposed to make this morning, and he wrote me a note and he said you could make a very short speech. You could just answer the question, has the government destroying the American dream? Say yes and sit down. The great issue that we still face, despite having so much success in the election, is the relationship between the governors and the governed. That's always been the problem in our country. The government tries to keep us under control, and we try to keep the government under control. And we haven't been doing a very good job of keeping the government under control. That's why we're having the revolt that we're having. A young Frenchman came to this country in 1834, 1835 to study the American penal system. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. He ended up writing an epic book called Democracy in America, and he frequently quoted, and he said a lot because it was a long book, but one of the things that I always remember and remind myself of from time to time is something he said about the danger of the American democracy would be that in the end the government would become the shepherd and the people would become the sheep. And that was based on the idea that the government's doing so much for so many that they just do whatever the government says they ought to do. And we are heading in that direction very rapidly. Now this election, I think, may save us if we do everything that the contract with America proposed. The first thing would be to get the Congress under control. I remember when President Carter was governor, he was trying to get improve the Georgia prison system. This was not a Lester Maddox approach of getting a better class of prisoner, but they finally found a man to run the prison system who'd been in South Carolina, and then he'd been up in Connecticut running the prison system, and Governor Carter asked him how he was coming along with reforming the prison system. And he said, well, you can't reform anything until you get it under control. And we do not yet have the prison system under control. That is the problem with the Congress, getting it under control, because it's been run for years by the committee staffs. You may think it's being run by people on the congressman's staff or the senator's staff, but it's actually the committee staffs that have a stranglehold on the government, who get these long laws that most members of the Congress never really study, much less just read. And they are in charge of the Congress. I can tell you that. Now, under the contract with America, they're going to cut a third of the staff. This is going to be very hard on the Democrat staff members, and they say there's a lot of weeping going on in Washington right now because the way they got the Congress organized, three-fourths of the staff members are Democrats, are selected by the Democrats. Only 1/4 are selected by the Republicans, as I understand it. So if they're going to cut a third, most of them are going to come out of the Democratic part of the staff. I don't really care how they do it, but they need to get rid of them and bring somebody else in. I mean, it's not right under democracy for people who have not been elected to have control of the government, and they've got control of the Congress. And then, of course, President Clinton has got his children up there running the White House, and between the two, we've been in a bad shape. But I think this cut of the congressional staff will be good. In the recent years, the regulators have turned against the people. It's almost, President Bush said he was going to have a kinder and a gentler society. It would have been well to just start with the bureaucracies, make just somehow or another, get them under control just on one point. Just be kinder and gentler toward the people you're regulating. It's almost as if the government, when you deal with a bureaucrat, is an enemy. In recent times, it's gotten worse than I've ever seen it. I represent some people that own some tugboats, 3 tugboats, and they recently had 40 FBI agents come on board in a surprise to search the ships. They had a search warrant. They had sent 40 FBI agents to search 3 tugboats. They were looking to see if they hadn't had some kind of a pump on the boat that would, the bilge pump that would have pumped some oil in a river. Well, they could have found that out easy enough that it wouldn't have to, and think what that cost. Send 40 FBI agents and it didn't find a thing. Not one thing did they find. So this is the kind of way the Justice Department's running right now. That's a misuse, in my judgment, of the FBI. It must be something surely better they could be doing than executing search warrants on the Clean Water Act. So that's the kind of thing that's going on. That's nothing compared to just dealing with bureaucracy. Think about a citizen that wants to get to Social Security. Most all the congressmen have people on the staff just to help people get their Social Security for the first time. Just a little problem with the government. The government has got a real stranglehold on the people through the bureaucracy, and I haven't seen anything proposed in the contract with America that would bring that under control, unless there's some way to get a different group in who would be more dedicated to being fair and kinder and gentler. The federal aid to education is not addressed by the contract with America, but I remember very well when Governor Vanderbilt was governor and I was his chief of staff, and Congress was about to pass a federal aid to education. I said this will be the end of public education if the federal government tries to run it. And everybody said, oh no, they're just going to give you some money. Don't worry about it. They're just going to give you some money. So we got now public education running about like the post office used to run. Post office probably running a lot better now than the public education. But a lot of it had to do with first the state started taking over running it. Then the federal government got into it. And so we departed from local control of education. And that is where the trouble started. The other thing I wanted to mention is tort reform. We are spending vast sums of the health care money on litigation. You think, well, the plaintiffs are getting treated nice, they're getting a lot of money. Well, the fact is that in litigation today, the defense lawyers make as much as the plaintiff's lawyers because of the process, the discovery you have to go through and those sorts of things. So when somebody, we'll say in an asbestos industry or whatever the situation is, about a third of the money ends up with the plaintiffs, a third of the money goes to the plaintiff's lawyers, and a third goes to the defense lawyers. So I don't see how in our country we can put up with a system of tort law that's that inefficient. And that will have to be dealt with, and that is in the contract with America to do something about the tort system. We hear that we are run essentially in this country by the media. They tell us what to think. Everything's got a spin on it, and if you get somebody like President Clinton who's got expert spinners, it's hard to ever know what the truth is. But one of the things that we've been convinced of in the last 2 years is that gridlock is a bad thing. I grew up thinking, when I first began to understand the Constitution, I thought I had a constitutional right to gridlock. I had thought that that was what the founding fathers meant when they had separation of powers and checks and balances. You're supposed to have gridlock. Sometimes the president vetoes a bill, and you can't get it passed then. You can't get enough votes to override the veto. That's in the Constitution. That's pure gridlock. Now, what is wrong with that? Clinton ran on one of his planks was that he was going to break gridlock. That meant he was going to turn the Congress and the presidency over to one party. Well, I don't know if that's a good thing, but of course that could happen. But we ought not to have a spin on the Constitution to the point that we think there's something wrong with gridlock. There's not a thing wrong with it, and I'm glad we're going to reclaim our constitutional right to gridlock. We will hear a lot about what's wrong with the balanced budget amendment. You can see it starting now. It's going to cause, according to the media, this will cause a calamity in our country just to have a balanced budget amendment. There are 49 states that have balanced budgets. There are countless cities that have requirements for balanced budgets. And we'd have to have a balanced budget amendment. It had some exceptions in it. One would be if we had a war, we'd have to have an exception, but of course we'd eventually have to pay that money back. Maybe even if we had a real recession, not one that politicians say we're having, but one that's real, we might have to have some exception for that. But I went to see Senator Hollins about 10 years ago and told him I would appreciate it if he would introduce a bill so that Americans could pay their share of the national debt and be through with it. That I would like to pay my share because I wouldn't want my grandchildren to have to pay what really came to me. And he thought about it and he said, well, we better not get into that. He said, if you send any money up here to pay your share of the debt, we'll spend it for something else. And we know that because Social Security started out as a trust fund, now it's just in the general fund. And we now treat Social Security as if it was just regular tax instead of money that was supposed to have been paid into a trust fund. So nobody is interested really up till now in doing anything about paying off the national debt. So that'll go on to 2 or 3 generations. They'll all be saddled with the money that came to us. But I think we're going to have a balanced budget amendment. We've come very close to having a balanced budget amendment adopted in the Senate and the House in the past. So surely we'll get that. That's part of the contract with America, and that means that it will go out to the states, and the states will have a chance to ratify such an amendment. I think that we'll also get an amendment proposed on a constitutional amendment on term limits. I was a lawyer in the case that Speaker Foley brought in Seattle, Washington. I was a lawyer for term limits. It's too bad he won. If he had lost, he'd probably still be the Speaker. But he sued his own people. He didn't like what the people of Washington had done. Even his own district adopted term limits. So he brought a suit. In fairness to Speaker Foley, he brought the suit to put the issue at rest, let it go on to the Supreme Court and be resolved, because he didn't want to have a vote on it in the Congress. Well, it didn't work out that way. He won the case, and the people really got upset then and they voted him out of office. That may have not been the main thing, but I think it was. Meanwhile, the case is in the Supreme Court. It's going to be argued in the latter part of this month. Term limits from Arkansas. President and people there voted 75 to 25 for term limits. President Clinton is fighting it. He sent the Solicitor General over to argue against the people of Arkansas. Term limits is an idea whose time has come, and there's no way to get it stopped. We need to get Congress to address it, though, rather than the court system, because every state that's adopted term limits, well, not every state, but all states that have adopted term limits have not followed a uniform approach. Some of these amendments, like Arkansas, a House member could only serve 6 years. Some are 8, some are 10, some are 12. I think every one that so far has been adopted would let a senator serve 12 years, two terms. I think that the Congress, if they send out a term limits, amendment ought to make it 12 and 12. 12 in the House, 12 in the Senate. The Washington Post and some of the political commentators said this would cause the government to almost fall. That we wouldn't have all these experienced congressmen to tell us how to run things. Well, that's no longer an issue. Most of them are gone. So that's one problem we've taken care of. The idea of a line item veto is something that most states have, but not the president. This may be something that the President Clinton and the Congress could agree on. I don't know, but this might be something. The president ought to have a line item veto. They put all these this pork, they call it, in the appropriations bill. And you'd have to veto the whole appropriations bill. Well, the appropriation bill is never adopted till the last day, sometime a week later even. And so you'd have a shutdown of the government if you vetoed it. And the presidents never veto the appropriations bill. Therefore, you don't take the special projects of pork projects out of the appropriations bill. Most everything we do now has got some rider on the appropriations bill. Even the Iran-Contra started with what they call some amendment, I forget the name of it, but it was a rider on the appropriations bill that you couldn't, it was a crime to send, it wasn't a crime even, it was illegal to send money to help the Contras. And out of that, not a law, of course it is a law, but it was an amendment to the appropriations bill, but it was never debated. The Boland, B-O-L-A-N-D, Boland Amendment, named for Congressman Boland from Massachusetts. That was a part of the appropriations bill. That gives you an idea of the need for the line item veto. Not just pork, for other reasons too. It's not pass really laws that are not germane to the appropriation. So hopefully this will be done. I don't know of anybody, any student of government who does not believe that the federal government ought to have a line item veto. Health care, I think that all that's going to be done is the bill that was introduced in the last Congress where you have portability. You can take your health insurance from one job to another, and pre-existing medical conditions will be insurable, required to be insured. This will have something to do with the actuaries, but I'm sure that can be figured out. It'll be better than what we were facing in the last Congress. The health care that Mrs. Clinton offered us was reminding me of something that Senator Russell once told me about Vice President Hubert Humphrey. He said he liked Hubert. They served in the Senate together. But he said, Hubert Humphrey is the only man I know that I have met who has more solutions than the nation had problems. And that is the danger of the health care. We don't want to solve things that really don't need solving. And I think maybe this new Congress will know how to do that. What will can Clinton lose in 2 years? And all of this to be changed again. He can lose, but he can't lose if the Democrats stick together and the Republicans break up into factions. Some strong, some wise people have to get together to keep peace amongst the Republicans so they won't divide into factions. They can't divide over the liberals or the moderates and the Christian coalition and all the things they're doing, and they're getting plenty of help on dividing. You can be sure the media every day is going to be trying to divide the Republicans. So somehow or another they have to hold together, or we'll lose these things back and the government will be running us again. Even if we get some of these amendments through, we'll still be losing. So somewhere, and there are some wise people amongst the Republican leadership, and I believe they'll hold together. I'm sure most of you never thought Senator Dole would end up being in the middle. But things have changed so much that he's now in the middle. He might be the one that holds everyone together. But somebody has to hold the group together, and there's going to have to be people are going to have to give some so they can achieve the big goal, which is to get the presidency back. I've closed on 2 points that I think are worth making. One is that I'm very worried of what's going to happen to our nation if something happens to Ross Perot. He has become the national nanny. And we won't know how to vote unless he tells us how to vote. Second one is here in Georgia. How will the government survive in Georgia if something happens to Speaker Murphy? Thank you, and I'll be glad to take some questions.
Would you be willing to tell us when you changed parties?
What do you say?
He said, tell us when you've changed parties.
I never have changed. The party left me. I'm like Senator Shelby. If y'all saw him when he switched parties, he said he came to Washington thinking he could function as a Southern Democrat, and he found that that was impossible to do in Washington. What I do now is I pick out who I want to vote for. If we could register as an independent, I think I'd be an independent. But in this last election, I voted for 2 Democrats, and everyone else was a Republican. I voted for Milner, for example, and I think Governor Miller has been doing a good job as governor. And the reason I voted really for Milner, 2 reasons. We need a Republican governor. It's been a long time since we had one in Georgia. We need to build up 2 parties. We're not there yet. You might think we have 2 parties, but we're not quite there in Georgia. We only have about a third of the Senate, not that much of the House. That's got to be changed. But I thought, despite Governor Miller doing a pretty good job as governor, you could be sure he's going to be the out front man, almost like a campaign manager again for President Clinton. And I didn't want to give him the opportunity of doing me in. And other people like me. I mean, that's just something that I learned in South Georgia, I guess. Don't help somebody do you in. Yeah.
Judge Bell, we read in the Atlanta Constitution Journal over the weekend about a 19-year-old young woman who was subject to I believe, a GBI catch of some sort. Sounded like a traffic to me. But it was the second time, and she had $25 worth of crack cocaine. And she's been convicted as a dealer and has now been mandatorily sentenced to life in prison. And we lost our minds.
Well, this is one of the great problems of the nation. We have now in prisons in this country 1,200,000 people. We got another 400,000 in jails at any given time. But in prisons, we have 1,200,000. We have more people in prison than any country on earth. Not even the Soviet Union had as many people in prison as we have. And I helped Bo Ginn when he ran for governor, and he had asked me if he got elected, which he didn't, to take over the question of what to do about people in prisons and how to change the laws and whatever in Georgia. And we were going to start out with an inventory of separating out the violent crime offenders and keeping them in, and then graduate the others on a graduated scale, different minimum standard prisons of working in the community, whatever. Go back to the county work camps, and that never came to pass. We could still do something like that. There are a lot of people in all prisons who are not violent. The problem started with trying to solve the drug problem. A large percentage of people in the federal prisons now are drug offenders. And they get real long sentences. There's no way to rehabilitate them because they're going to be in prison so long. 5 years is about the minimum, and most of them will be 10 to 20 years. So this is just a total waste, even if you could save them. Now, they do put most of them in, if they own drugs. So the big ones are not on drugs. They're just in the business of trafficking. We'd badly need to take a new approach to this problem. And instead of taking a new approach, we got a new approach all right now. 2 strikes and you're out, or 3 strikes and you're out. The federal system is even going to have 3 strikes and you're out. We can't keep going. I was under President Bush. I was chairman of the Federal Prison Industries Board, and they you run these businesses in prison, so prisoners have something to do. Most American business people are opposed to it because they say it's putting prisoners in competition with regular business. But at any rate, I was chairman. I resigned when President Clinton got elected so he could put their own person in. I think the job's still vacant, but the studies I saw there said that by 2000, just that's not very long off, 6 years, we would be approaching 2 million people in prison in this country. So this is going to build up to be almost into a crisis if we don't do something about it. And we're doing the opposite of something about it. We're trying to put more people in prison, making it more severe. That has to be dealt with. That crack cocaine case is a good example. We're doing nothing to solve the drug problem in this country. We have never had a president, never, that came out against the user and said the user ought to be punished, that the user is bringing our country down, that the user is not patriotic. It is not patriotic to destroy your own country. Not one president has ever said anything like that. Not President Reagan, not President Carter, not President Bush, and certainly not President Clinton. So what are we doing? We're just trying to catch the traffickers. We're using the military to do it. We ought to dry up the market. The user is the only way to solve the drug problem. And that woman you're talking about, with the second offender with crack cocaine, you can ride with the police, you see crack cocaine everywhere, and it's amongst all people, poor people, rich people, black, white, it doesn't matter, it's pervasive. So we've got to have some real leadership in this area, and the contract with America doesn't address this problem. I think it needs to be addressed more on the local level, but the user problem, but the president's got to be the leader. I'm having trouble hearing in this room. Tell me what he said.
He said, in terms of term limits, I believe, how do you deal with expanding the bureaucracy?
Well, that's one of the you've been reading the media on that. That's a principal argument the media makes against term limits, particularly the Atlanta Constitution, that we got to be careful of the bureaucracy that'll take over. Congressmen won't amount to anything. I think that's a very insulting attitude to take towards somebody that's been elected to the Congress. That'd be the same thing as saying when I was a judge, I didn't know what I was doing. I had my law clerks in charge of everything, which would be absolutely false. Most people you elect to Congress have walking around sense, and they don't need a bunch of staff people telling them what to do. So I'm willing to trust the people we elect. And I think that's what we all ought to do, trust the people we elect. And if they're not doing the job, we'll get rid of them, get somebody else. That's what the American system is. And by the way, when the founding fathers, in particular Jefferson, who was not a founding father because he was an ambassador, he wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but he wrote a lot on this. And the idea was that we'd have a Congress made up of people who didn't give up their regular job. They just went to serve the public, and they would serve a few years and come back and take up whatever trade or occupation they had before they went. That was the sense of the people at that time. Nobody ever thought that we'd have a dynasty. The people would move to Washington and talk to each other and not come home very often, but have a system where they work all year round. It's a big thing now if they get 2 weeks off. We ought not to let them do that. If they can't get the work of the people done in 6 months, we ought to replace them, get somebody else. That has to stop. I'll tell you, I've been in Washington, and it is a very bad place for people talking to each other. All wisdom is right there. And I'm so radical in my views about it, I would break up Washington and move these departments. I'd move the Department of Agriculture, for example, I'd move it to Iowa, which is the heart of the farming area. And I'd break them all up, and this is the gridlock, the lobbyists and the congressmen and the bureaucrats. They all are right there inside the Beltway. So don't believe that. Yeah.
In view of Congress's propensity to spend and the effect of entitlements always motivating more spending, does a balanced budget amendment without any limit on taxation run the risk of becoming a mandate to keep increasing taxes?
The balanced budget amendment puts discipline in the system. If you're going to raise taxes, you're out of balance, you've got to raise taxes or cut something, just like the Georgia legislature's had to do twice in the last 20 years. They've had to have a special session, and each time we had a choice. We could raise taxes or we could cut spending. Both times we cut spending. Entitlement is not the problem if we were to face it. We have been fooled into thinking that we're cutting entitlements. There's never been a suggestion that anybody's entitlement would be cut. You're cutting the increase. When Lyndon Johnson was president, they put this consumer price index in. We started indexing everything in the country. All your employees get a raise based on the consumer price index. Rents are charged on that basis. Entitlements go up. And I've never studied the consumer price index, but I'm told that one item in it is that people over 65 buy new houses. Well, think how inflationary that is. Just that one thing. So what we need to do is reduce the increase. And this program that Sam Nunn and Senator Domenici were working on how to balance the budget by the year 2000, had one suggestion was that instead of getting a 3% increase, you get 2%. You're still getting an increase, but you're getting an increase below the CPI. Or you could rework the CPI and make it realistic. It shouldn't be higher than the inflation rate. If you do, just by geometric progression, we will all be working for the government, and money won't be worth anything. So I think that the entitlement problem can be handled, but you won't get as big a raise as you've been getting. I grew up in World War II and in the 50s, and I bought a house in Atlanta, and I had a 4% loan on my house, interest loan. 4% was the interest rate. And you could get, actually, if I'd had older and had more money, more income, I probably could got one lower than that. Inflation would be, some years would be zero. It's impossible for it to be zero now with the consumer price index being what it is. But we're not as informed as we ought to be, and I think a lot of it has to do with the media. And I must say about the media, I don't mean to be harping on the media, maybe the media is not informed. Maybe they believe the things they say. So, yeah.
Given all the recent publicity about Clarence Thomas, do you think a confirmation hearing is a reasonable forum to adjudicate things like sexual harassment claims of 10 years previous?
I do not. I think the Senate judiciary hearings on judges are almost a disgrace. I think it has become a television operation, and everybody is trying to be on the tube. And I think it's a very bad thing. But having said that, I must say that I'm biased. I was a victim of the Senate Judiciary Committee myself. It took me 2 weeks to get confirmed as Attorney General. I was accused of everything you can imagine, and it was on television. And I finally, at the end of the first week, I was told by Senator Robert Byrd that if I didn't agree to keep the director of the FBI, who was in there as a temporary person, that he would run the hearing another week. This was a Democrat doing a Democrat like this. So, and doing President Carter that way. So President Carter had already told me to find someone else to take over from Director Kelly at the FBI. So I told Senator Byrd I couldn't do that. I said, I'm already on the instructions to find someone else. And he said, and I said, why don't you talk with President Carter about it? He said, no, I don't need to talk with him. You either agree to it or we're going to extend this hearing a week, and every nut and crank in America will come out from under the rocks. He said, you'll be sorry. Boy, he was right. He was right, but I never gave in. And we did replace the director. And that's what you have to do. It's hard to stand up to that kind of power. But anyway, the committee, I don't know what to do about it, but I think this is a deep subject, and I'll have to tell you what happens. You can make your own judgment. When I became Attorney General, Senator Eastland was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. We have an FBI report on every person that might be nominated for a high post, including judges. Judges are the only ones where you get an IRS check run on them. And all that information would be given only to Senator Eastland. He never asked to read an FBI raw file. And he would not let anybody else on the committee see it. Would not ask the Attorney General to make it available to anyone else on the committee. So things worked pretty well. We'd have a hearing, and you didn't have all this data to disclose and ask them about. And you ask them, about what kind of lawyer they were, what kind of judge they'd been on in another system. And you'd have enough information. Senator Eastland would tell them if there was anything real bad. Actually, if something real bad, we wouldn't send them the name up. Well, when Senator Eastland retired, Senator Kennedy became chairman of the committee. So he said, well, everybody on the committee has got a right to read the raw FBI files. That was the beginning of it, right there. Then he said that we got to get our own investigators. So the Republicans said, well, if you want one for the Democrats, we'll get an investigator. So now, here we are. We're up to the committee and the staff reading the FBI raw files, and every FBI file's got some gossip in it. Of course, they interview 125 people, and on 125 interviews, somebody will say something bad about somebody, most of the time. The only file I ever read, and I read every file on a judge, one of the few I ever read where nobody said anything bad about anybody, was Bill Webster, when we selected him for the FBI director. He'd been passed twice as a judge as well, so but it's a rare thing. All right, so they're not satisfied with that, and with the IRS check. Only judges get an IRS check. They go and get their own investigators. And people say, why does it take so long? Well, that's why it takes so long, but by the time they do all that, and you had all those Senate staffers calling people, trying to talk Anita Hill into testifying, for example. Then there's a story somewhere in the last 2 or 3 days I read about what the Republican staffers were doing at the same time. They were trying to find people to come in and testify against her. What sort of a thing, what kind of business is that? I think Senator Hatch, when he becomes a chairman, ought to put a stop to that and go back to doing about what Senator Eastland did. And they don't need any investigators themselves. If they can't rely on the FBI, then they ought to just give up and go get on another committee. So I am very much opposed to the way they're running it. And the public ought to demand that it be improved. I'll tell you what we're doing. We're getting to the point where a lot of people wouldn't want to undergo that. And so why would you want to eliminate a lot of people who would be good public servants because of what you put them through? I'll tell you, I'll close on this because it gives you a pretty good idea of what it was. When I got through being beat on in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I've made a public statement that I'd never again appear before a Senate committee. Well, I left Washington. President Carter called me and asked me to be head of the American delegation to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was familiarly known at the time as the Helsinki Accord. Now this is going to take place in Spain, Madrid. So I agreed to do it, and it just didn't. I thought it was a short-term thing. It never occurred to me I'd have to be confirmed in the Senate. So I got all these papers from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I got another set from the White House staff. I got another set from the Government Ethics Office. 3 sets of papers arrived at my office. So I called President Carter and told him I didn't believe I was going to take the job. I appreciated it, but I had to stand for confirmation. And I'd made this statement. I'd look terrible, to destroy my credibility with the American people if I appeared before the Senate. So he called Warren Christopher, who was the Deputy Secretary of State then, and told Warren that he wanted me to have this job. and it's supposed to be a rank of ambassador. But I wouldn't go before the Senate. Said find a way for him to take it without going before the Senate. Well, they found a law that said I could be a special ambassador for 6 months without Senate confirmation. So I went over there and did it. I was a special ambassador. Well, this is fine. I'm still keeping my word. President Reagan appointed me to the Commission on Violent Crime as co-chair of that, and I didn't have to go before the Senate. Then I was on the Secretary Schultz appointed me to the Commission on South Africa, and I didn't have to go before the Senate. President Bush called me and asked me to be vice chairman of the Federal Commission, the Commission on Federal Ethics. I didn't think a thing about that. I said, oh, I'd be delighted to do it. Well, I got papers in from the Senate. And I had to fill out all this form about my finances. And finally I got out of the Senate, but I still had to file this financial return, which is very complicated. And I said, I'm not going to do this. I'm too old to have to put up with this. I'm not going to do it. So I was going to call him and tell him that I didn't want to be appointed. And by the next morning, I calmed down, and I could see the newspaper headlines. Bell withdraws name to be co-chairman of the Federal Ethics Commission. That would appear to the public immediately that I had some ethical problem. So on mature judgment, I decided I'd have to go through with it. I couldn't stand to have people think that I had something wrong with my ethics. So I did fill out the form, but I don't think I'm going to ever do it again. Thank you.